Hi, everyone. I'm Denise Garth, Chief Strategy Officer at Majesco, and you're listening to the Future of Insurance Industry Leaders podcast series. Follow along as I interview the best and brightest leaders in the insurance industry and insurtech landscape to bring you the latest in digital transformation, innovation, industry trends, challenges, and opportunities, as well as next-gen technologies. We use our experience to anticipate what's next without losing sight of what's now. Stay tuned to find out your next now. Welcome, everybody, to today's podcast, Future of Insurance. I got to tell you, this is going to be an amazing podcast because I've got Andrew Johnston here, Global Head of Gallagher insurtech. Andrew and I've gotten to know each other over the last year, so he invited me to write an article in his third quarter last year about insurtech publication, and we got lots to talk about. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Denise, for having me. Yeah, it's been really wonderful to get to know you so much better. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see Denise's piece in the Q3 reports that went out in November, it's absolutely worth a read. It's sort of seminal stuff from an expert that really understands this space. Thank you again for participating in that also.
Oh, my pleasure, Andrew. And thanks for asking. One of the things you and I talked about is, first of all, before we kind of get into that, I want you to kind of give a little bit of background on yourself and your current focus, because it's a small industry, but I find that some people still don't know each other in this industry. And
yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I mean, I kind of started in this sort of current trajectory about 10 years ago. And before that, Denise, I'd done a variety of things back in the UK. I was an academic and then worked in some agricultural businesses, worked in a couple of startups, then ended up in the UN, worked at the UN for a few years, and then just had a complete career change. So I joined what was Willis Re, the reinsurance broking arm of Willis Towers Watson, back in 2016. And at that time was hired as a senior researcher, really with the focus to understand trends, evolving trends in the market at that point from the perspective of a layperson, right? I had no sort of formal reinsurance background. And at that time, things like cyber, the sharing economy, and fintech more broadly were on everybody's lips, but people didn't really know what it meant in a material sense. And out of the embers of fintech, this thing insurtech kind of started to gather momentum and catch a hold. And as a globally recognized reinsurance broker, we were being asked by our primary client base, which are insurers typically, but MGAs and reinsurers also, what the evolution of insurtech meant for their businesses. And we didn't really have a sort of practice that was dedicated to helping those sorts of questions. So I launched Willis Re insurtech at the beginning of 2017, really to kind of act as an advisor to clients to help them understand what the role of technology was in their business, whether or not this sort of fear of disruption was justified. And quite quickly, the conversations would become opportunistic. And because we were simultaneously seeing so many of the insurtech companies, you know, when we were speaking to traditional clients about what the impact could be, they were actually more interested in the opportunity than the fear of disruption. And that was the basis of that practice. As the insurtech label evolved and became more synonymous with funding, it sort of evolved away from just being software companies that were building tools for the insurance industry, but actually started to encapsulate digital risk originators also. So these are digitally native insurance companies, digitally native MGAs, many of whom had a balance sheet that as they grew required the services of reinsurance capacity and a reinsurance broker. So the practice kind of bifurcated at that point so that we have this advisory function now for clients, and we also have the broking function for insurtech clients. And that's really been the mainstay of the insurtech practice right through the merger up until now. In addition to that, I published that report that you contributed to, which I know now has a sort of huge global audience, where we are able to publish the latest insurtech investment trend information. And then I also developed some software internally as well. So a bit of a sort of varied path, but that's where we get to today.
Yeah, it sounds like a very path similar to me, although I've been in the industry my entire career, but lots of different types of organizations and roles. I think it gives you a different kind of perspective, particularly looking at insurtech and technology in general. You know, when you have that different kind of background rather than just come up through the same background all the time, which really kind of gets us to the insurtech experiment. And when we talked about this, it's really a decade-old $50 billion experiment that has been happening over the last 10 years. So with that decade, we've had some insurtechs who are proving naysayers wrong now. They're actually successful. And then there's those that haven't been. What did we learn through this experience? What did we get wrong? And what are those examples of success and why?
What a wonderful question. And I think it sort of underpins all of this, right? Which is to try and look for the patterns of success. And to your point, I mean, tens of billions of dollars have been invested in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of that represents both the kind of advertised return for investors to disrupt an industry like ours that is extremely profitable. There is this, I think, false premise that it's ripe for disruption. And I think that that hypothesis has been proven to be wrong on a sort of general basis, but there are undoubtedly pockets of opportunity to innovate in and around. And I think the companies that have been really successful are ones that have come in and expressed a lot of humility. I think that's probably the most common thing that we see with the success stories is companies that understand that our industry is a community, right? Is not a highly commoditized buying and selling process. It is a community of companies that are supporting the pooled sharing of risk against a fixed economy of available capacity. And those companies that have done well have spotted problems, they've spotted opportunities, but they've understood the makeup of that community, have pivoted when they've needed to. I think the focus shouldn't always just be on insurtech as well. I mean, I think the insurers and the reinsurers and the intermediaries have also evolved their thinking over the last 10 years. And I think this is a part of the story that possibly isn't spoken about enough. But there is a general sense among most of the incumbents that they could do more with technology and that they could be more cutting edge. To that extent, they have wanted to test and trial different types of technology. And that is inherently quite an expensive process, which I think also rationalizes some of that investment amount. But I think as an industry now, we have got to a place of maturity where the focus is less on the insurtech technology as a product, but more as an environment where sensible commercial business outcomes can be achieved and the underlying technology can help in that achievement process. But the focus should not be on what the technology can do and then try and find a part of the business where it can be most effective. That has just not worked. And so where we've been able to speak in traditional business terms, where we've been able to talk about profitability in terms of, expense margins and loss ratios, things have been much more successful than how can we attack a total addressable market of 60 billion in the US. It's just a completely different type of conversation that's going on right now.
No doubt. And we have no shortage of capital to invest. There's a big amount of capital sitting on the sidelines ready to invest. When we kind of think about that, what defines a good investment? What do you think the investments are going to look like over the next decade? And what organizations have the greatest investment and ownership take? Because I think when we started out 10 years ago, it was a lot of VC firms or angel investors in some cases. And we've evolved now that we've got insurers investing and we've got other types of organizations. And now private equity is buying some of these insurtechs. We were one of those bought. And so it's really shifted where some of the money is, where the money is getting invested. So what do you see kind of happening, Andrew?
So the grey matter has definitely shifted. There was a period, sort of particularly in 2019, 2020 and 2021, where there was an influx of sort of non-traditional insurance venture capital that was dabbling in insurtech, right? And there were a number of companies that were making sort of one-off bets and then kind of not doing anything else. Where we are seeing a shift in that trend is that those sorts of companies have largely exited this space. And the investors that have remained resilient are those boutique insurtech, either management of funds or straight up investors themselves. But to your point, a lot of insurers and reinsurers are now investing at unprecedented levels. And what I think is really interesting is in 2024, 150 insurtech investments were made by insurers and reinsurers. And that is growth in both relative terms, but also in real terms. And to put that into perspective for you, in 2021, which was the peak of the insurtech bubble, for want of a better word, only 109 reinsurance investments were made.
Almost 50%.
Yeah. And so, like I say, both in relative and real terms, that has grown massively. And I think it's indicative of a maturation of the space where insurers and reinsurers are more comfortable now with what it is that they're actually trying to get out of this. And I think that comfort goes back to what we were talking about not just a few moments ago, where it's not really about the technology anymore. It's about the underlying business model that is supporting. Now, I think that with things like artificial intelligence, there are renewed interests in the advertised returns of what a successful exit might look like in the insurance industry should one of these newer artificial intelligence companies get it right, which will undoubtedly pique the interest of some of those traditional VCs and PEs. But I think that we're going to see a healthier blend of some of those standalone mega round deals that are a bit of a punt from companies in the West Coast and that kind of thing. But I think more often than not, we're going to see activity coming from funds that are associated with companies that really understand our industry, whether or not they're in it directly or sort of sitting closely alongside it.
I know your most recent report, which was Q4 for 2024, there was a shift in dollars of investment. It was a pretty big shift. And what do you kind of make of that, Andrew?
I try not to read too much into any one quarter, and that's not me skirting the question, Denise, but I think that you compare that to the prior quarter, there was a drop of almost half. Having said that, that half in Q3 was made up of 5 mega round deals. That's any deal above $100 million. And they aren't scheduled at any particular time. There's no rhyme or reason why 5 might happen in one quarter and then 0 might happen in another. So I think on this particular occasion, we can more or less chalk it up to the fact that we just didn't see a handful of those sort of bonanza-sized deals. Exactly. But having said that, if we see it for another 2 or 3 quarters, I think we can start to infer that there's a trend. But I think on this point, I would probably just, like I say, schedule that as just timing. But it does remind us of just how nascent the space remains in that, 5 deals, right? We're not talking about many, can have such a seismic impact on the overall aggregate that I think we are reminded that we're still, in some regards, in the infancy of investing.
With that, how would we want to label insurtech today and in 10 years? How will it shift and change, do you think, for the next decade?
I think a lot of lessons have been learned from, let's call it 1.0, for want of a better word. And I think a lot of people have realized that you need to have insurance expertise as well as technology expertise. I think a lot of companies have also realized that, particularly if they're in the risk origination space, they really need to be part of this community and they need to understand at a sort of empathetic level what it takes to be a part of that community. These are also, and I'm going to say something very trite, but I think it's worth saying, I think companies realize that they've got to solve something that exists as either as a problem or as a part of a process that could be better, right? And we saw a lot in that 1.0 generation of, particularly about things like blockchain, people trying to find the problem for which they'd already created the solution. And to be completely honest with you, given the nature of negotiation and ongoing, price changes within our industry, a very binary, immutable record of the truth doesn't really add a lot of value. And so I think we're also going to see different types of technologies become more valuable inherently as we test and trial more, which is why I'm very bullish about artificial intelligence, because I do think inherently it has more applicable value, even if we kind of use it as a sort of an umbrella term for what is, many different cognitive types of technologies. And then I think beyond that, we will probably lose the label altogether. And I realize that's a punchy opinion to have, but I think over time, technology is becoming so ubiquitous with our industry that the need to call it out as something different doesn't really matter anymore. It would almost be like saying, I'm a .com company. It's just assumed that you're going to be online, right? And so I think that the industry will probably get to a place where the label of insurtech is a historical thing talked about in the past tense. But for the time being, I think we'll still have to treat it as a separate animal.
Let's dive a little bit into this role of technology, because we've kind of talked a little bit about it as we talked about this last decade. My gosh, I don't think there's ever been a time in my career that I've seen the pace of technology kind of coming out and getting adopted over the last 5-7 years in particular. But you're right. It was all about technology at the beginning of insurtech, and now it's about the business. What is it going to do for the business, and how are we going to really relook at the business fundamentals? How's it going to impact it? How's it going to change that target operating model? to make it more efficient, make it more effective for customers. What do you think is the role now in kind of making sure that we're focusing in on that business fundamental and operating model? And how do we have to kind of shift our thinking through in that?
Well, I think it's already happening, right? And I think part of that is the relative drying up of some of that venture capital, which was allowing companies to trial and error almost to their heart's content. Whereas I think that the restrictions now that insurers and reinsurers and anybody that might adopt these technologies are putting upon these businesses in the context of having less capital to burn means that almost out of the gate, they need to be business focused. And if they cannot articulate in ROI terms or in sort of accretive efficiency gain terms what they're doing, then the technology itself is kind of meaningless. And I think that there is just this growing confidence among insurers and reinsurers to almost force a vendor or an insurtech to justify what they can do in these traditional business metrics. I come back to that. There's less kite flying. There's less, shall we talk about the art of the possible? Shall we talk about these things in isolation? Shall we house them in laboratories or innovation communities that are somehow separate from the business? We just don't really see that anymore. People have got to come into the core part of the business and justify themselves. If they can't, more often than not, it's a conversation that's nice to have. And I think our industry more broadly is going through so much change, and there's so much pressure on our industry to remain relevant, to respond to, changing threat vectors, to respond to the change of liquidity availability, that these sorts of things cannot be treated as separate anymore. If they're not part of the overall success change or trajectory, then they don't really make sense anymore.
There's a lot of emerging technologies, AI, machine learning, IoT, blockchain, and others. Do you think there's any of those technologies that are truly game-changing for insurance? And how do you suggest insurers kind of prioritize looking at these technologies for their businesses? Because there's a lot out there.
Yeah, again, great question. So the report series that we put out, so we broke up last year into 4 pieces, and we sort of positioned that against the value chain of insurance and reinsurance. So with Q1, we started with sales and distribution. With Q2, we focused on risk, which was portfolio underwriting and pricing. Q3, which you participated in, was on sort of central business operations, policy admin, that kind of thing. And Q4 was in claims. And within the context of those 4 quadrants of the value chain, we looked at what we thought were the most relevant types of artificial intelligence technology. And I think as an umbrella group of companies, they are inherently the most applicable to our industry. And so within something like claims, the most applicable kind of AI is different from the sort of thing that might be the most applicable in policy administration. But I think claims is probably the area where you can return most quickly your investment using artificial intelligence technology, particularly in claims fraud detection. And that's largely being driven by a variety of OCR technology, but also data entry and classification technology and analytics technology that can effectively run a multitude of different models simultaneously, looking in a kind of 4D way for behavior that, when grouped together at an aggregate level, could indicate fraudulent activity. The tools that have been really successful in that space, Denise, are those that support human beings. They don't make the decision, nothing is delegated in a real sense, but they are almost in a bionic kind of way, supporting the human to make a quicker decision, a more comfortable decision, a more confident decision. And the sorts of returns that we're seeing in terms of reducing claims fraud detection, which has a direct capital return, is quite breathtaking.
Couldn't agree with you more that the whole umbrella of AI, it really has the most opportunity for game changing in the industry, but it's also so dependent upon data.
100%.
And as an industry, we still struggle with data, and we struggle then to gain any kind of actionable insights. And then even more so with the AI and machine learning models, you need the right data to train those models to get the right kind of results. And if you're a small insurer, you may not even have the right data, let alone enough data to do it. So you've got to look at, where you can get some of those sources of data. And it really gets to a point of, we have to look at, how does data play into this, and how do we as an industry and organizations get access and share data more effectively, to some extent, a democratization of data. Kind of talked a little bit about that. But talk about where you see kind of this focus on data, and how do we really finally have to get our arms around this? Because
this is the big thing, right? It's always the elephant in the room. And I think the industry actually probably does a better job of collecting data than we give ourselves credit for. But I think one of the biggest issues that we have as an industry is what could be considered quote unquote relevant data is so large compared to so many other industries that we have a sort of disadvantage out of the gate, because there are so many factors and so many nuances that try to form an overall picture of, let's say, risk in one example, that it is quite an overwhelming thing, which is why I think we need to go back to the human in the loop and actually work with human expertise to try and understand from a business perspective what a hypothesis might be around risk selection or portfolio management or underwriting, and almost use the data to support those hypotheses, not prove them. Okay. And when you have that hypotheses in place that is being supported by available data, that's when you can scale. I think the mistake that a lot of companies have made over the last 10 years is just to try and gather as much data as they can and almost hope that the solution reveals itself in the volume. And more often than not, it's actually counterintuitive. The opposite generally happens, which is why you've got to prioritize that market expertise, which you're only ever going to find in people. I've sort of tried to make the solution sound reasonably straightforward. Even the best case scenario is chaos. Even if you're in a small state and you only write one class of business and you have a very homogeneous demographic, it's still really difficult, okay? It's incumbent upon us to get it right. And I think that with ever more increasingly available sources of data and origination points of data, we've just got to be very intellectually honest as an industry about what's relevant, what's not relevant, where we prioritize, what we don't prioritize. And the numbers are not going to reveal that. It's the people that have got to make almost a gut instinct decision on the basis of their experience to help us navigate through that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things that we talked about that I found just absolutely fascinating is a statement you made is that as an industry, we've got intellectual dishonesty with AI. And with GenAI now, the hottest topic in the industry, and it's more than technology. Talk about your view on this intellectual dishonesty and what does that mean, and how does that really impact what we're seeing emerging, you know, with AI, with the operating models, and how GenAI is kind of coming into the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I think GenAI is a good example of where it's a bit like blockchain, really. It's probably not inherently the most relevant type of technology for most things. And I think that most large language models have got a way to go beyond creating text sentiment. You know, it might be part of a chatbot story or might be part of an internal search. But when I think about one or two types of technology that could truly change the industry, it doesn't stack up to things like data entry classification technology. I mean, you can't even compare them. And I think what I kind of was alluding to about the intellectual dishonesty is integrating the technology is only 50% of the issue, okay? What we need to be better at as an industry is articulating what we then do with the efficiency savings and the cost savings to then actually realize the ROI. What we're seeing time and time again, even in successful integrations, is that where we might be saving money or might be saving people's time, we're not then very good at articulating what they should be doing with those savings or time, or let's say job type realignment, to actually make the most of the technology. And people are less forthcoming in wanting to have those conversations. And I actually think that they need to be part of the initial conversation. They need to be part of the initial business articulation about what you want to actually do. You know, I want to save, 20% of the workforce time. Okay. If you save that time, but you want to keep the same number of people in employment, what do you do with that 20%? Do you have a plan for how you're going to utilize those people's time better than you currently are? And that conversation just isn't really happening, which I think is such a shame, because in some ways it's the easier part of the equation. But I just don't know that the industry is in a position to kind of think it through as lucidly as maybe it ought to be.
I think that's a really great point, because I think that it gets back to, there's another kind of dimension of that, Andrew, that when we think about, I don't care what technology you're implementing or you're transforming your business with, if it's policy, it's billing, it's claims, it's underwriting, whatever it may be, we've too often just kind of ripped out the old and put in a new and tried to keep everything the way we did it. Mm-hmm. I did a podcast with our CEO at the beginning of the year that we've got to learn to say no. Got to say, because today's era of insurance business is very different. Different expectations. We got a different set of talent that comes in to work inside insurance companies and have an expectation of technology they want to work with. Got different risks, we've got different data, and we got to rethink our business processes. And so if you can leverage the technology and leverage what they've built in, and if GenAI is built in there to automatically drive some optimization, don't try to take what you did today and try to recreate it in the new. That's another element of intellectual dishonesty here.
We see it all the time. And it is that old Henry Ford adage, right? I mean, and it is true. But I think, again, as part of this overall intellectual dishonesty, I wonder how often when companies are thinking about their transformation journey, they actually spend time talking to their policyholders, or they actually spend time talking to staff members and trying to gather their sentiment as well about how expectations are changing. And just to kind of digitize an old process because that's where people are comfortable seems to just miss the opportunity, right? But I think that there are so many moving parts, and I think that there are so many vested interests in this that to limit a technological innovation strategy to a lab, for example, just doesn't make sense. And yet that seems to be the starting point. It's like, no, that in some ways is the end bit, right? Like once you know everything and you are finally at the point where you know exactly what you're looking for and you know almost without thinking what the technology would need to do to answer all your questions, that's when you maybe form a lab or something and you start vetting the options. But to begin there and then hope that it kind of figures itself out, it just seems to me like a misnomer.
Couldn't agree with you more. We have this whole new kind of set of talent. We've got estimates are in the next 5 years, 40% of our industry is going to retire, Andrew. And
wow,
with that walks out a lot of intellectual knowledge, things in people's heads, understanding of the industry. And we've got a different set of younger workers that are coming in and they have a different expectation of working. I think this is where some of these technologies are really going to become even more increasingly important, is this transition of the workforce and the expectations. It's not just about a tech-driven generation. They want to really do something of value. And as an industry, we do something of value, but to allow them to have that empathy to talk to a customer and have the technology to do that becomes even more important. So kind of talk about kind of what you see and how this next 10 years of a decade of insurtech, how do business leaders need to kind of rethink that as well? Because that's an element of this intellectual dishonesty too.
I mean, I hadn't heard that statistic. It's sort of blown my mind a little bit, Denise, to be honest with you. I don't really feel equipped to kind of give you a succinct answer because I'm still processing that. I think we just got to be honest about, the transition of knowledge. And I do think that such a big part of this is keeping the human in the loop and keeping that expertise front and center. And so any kind of transition needs to be extremely well thought through. And that's incumbent on any organization, really. But I think that we need to be cognizant of the sorts of environments where people want to work if we want to attract the right kind of talent. I think that the insurance industry is actually doing a really good job of trying to position and advertise itself to newer generations, but it's just going to take time, right? Because there is still an image and a brand that's associated that will take a while. But I do think that will change because I think it's not just the insurance industry that suffers from that. But I think what's really interesting is we kind of focus on the now and the next year and don't always look at the next 10 years. And one example I'll give you what I mean by that is a few years ago, lots of companies wanted to hire people that could code because it felt like that was such an important thing to do. And now we've actually got technology that basically codes for you. And so there's always going to be a demand for those super sophisticated, high-end, high-caliber coders. But the people that are kind of doing the day-to-day stuff have largely been eliminated. And so I think that there's a lot of sense in just trying to, I know this is inherently your question, but predict what the next 10 years is going to look like and assume that the technology will never stop evolving. And so again, I come back to it's got to be about the person because that's the thing that's less likely to change so quickly. But that transition of knowledge and expertise has got to be a priority for the business right now. And I'm really glad you raised that because I hadn't really thought about it. And it's something I'm going to have to think about a lot when talking to clients. It's so important, right?
It is. And I think if you go back to your point about really trying to create the ROI and the true business value, that's why we've got to kind of think about it because that business value now is changing based on this shift of the different talent that's coming in. We got to rethink, where do we start with a business value proposition?
I think so. And I think, again, it's incumbent on us to make this all relevant and be part of a world where people do see the value in what the insurance and reinsurance industry does. And I think that on the whole, we do a great job as an industry of sort of proving our value to everybody, including future pools of talent. But we're almost a bit too humble about it sometimes. And I think that the insurance industry, and particularly the reinsurance industry, is sometimes hidden a little bit behind the curtain. And, I tell people what I do for a living and hardly anybody knows what it is. And then I sort of explain what it is. And they're like, oh my God, this is like the wheel behind the wheel. It's like, yeah, this is a huge, huge industry that's very, very important. But I don't think we've done a good enough job of articulating just how important and just how exciting it can be and how relevant it is. I often recommend the reinsurance industry to people looking at their careers because I think it's a fascinating place to be where you can actually affect positive change. And I think as an industry, we could do a better job of that.
I couldn't agree more. So as we kind of wrap up here, I always try to end the podcast with the same question. I think we're close to 100 or just going over 100 podcasts now. There's been slight variations, but it's been pretty interesting over the period of time how people have different kind of perspectives. So if you could pick one word or phrase to describe the future of insurance, what would it be and why?
Sustainable.
Oh, I love that one.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Everything we do has got to have that top of mind. It has to be.
Has to. Otherwise, we don't have the protection they need.
Right. We have got to be so aware of this growing protection gap. We've got to be so aware of where the liquidity is coming from. We've got to be so aware of what's driving underwriting decisions. We've got to be so aware of what type of technology can actually deliver on that long-term value. And to me, they all more or less gravitate back towards this idea of sustainability and not doing anything for the now without considering tomorrow.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Andrew, as always, it's been a great conversation.
Thank you for
Love
having
to
me.
collaborate with you. Love to have our conversations and looking forward to more here during 2025.
Thank you ever so much for having me, Denise.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Future of Insurance Industry Leaders podcast. Subscribe to our market-leading podcast series available wherever you get your podcast from. Thank you for listening and be sure to tune in the next time.